Okay, let's get started. So welcome everyone. I'm trying to make this a monthly event. So this is our one about chimping and, or what I call it, Blinkies, chimping and, chimping, blinkies and histogram. Yes. Uh, I like those terms, so I thought I'd throw them in there. I love histogram. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Good, good. Okay, so chimping, blinkies and histograms. So I don't need to tell you how big a marvel our digital cameras are. They really let us do a lot of things we couldn't do with film, and one of the best things they do is give us instant feedback on the pictures we shot. And so they'll tell us things like, is the composition good? Or is that the shutter speed I should be using? And you can look at the screen and determine that. Or am I getting enough depth of field? And they can even help with getting the exposure correct to an extent. And that's where a lot of photographers get fooled, and we often get into trouble. Yeah, see who's here, who's in this photo. So I thought we'd start by talking about chimping. And so chimping is when you look at the image on the back of your camera. And the term comes from the early days of digital, when a bunch of photographers were at a basketball game and this big play happened in front of them. And they all pulled up their cameras and shot and went, ooh, 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 ooh. So you chimp your photos, right? So chimping is looking at the picture on the back of your camera after you shoot it. So that can be very useful for lots of things like composition, but not so much for exact exposure, unless you, it'll let you know when you're in the ballpark, but not exact where you're at. So if you're out making pictures on a day without direct sunlight hitting your screen while you're chimping, then you can see the screen pretty well, and you can tell, my picture looking pretty good. Yeah, for the most part. But on a bright sunny day, the sun's so bright you can't really see the screen. So unless you cover it, it's fairly useless, right? You're having to cover it up and see it. And then even then, it might not really tell you how bright or dark your image is, because you're fighting the sun to see the screen. So let's get another technical thing out of the way right now. The image you see when you're chimping is a JPEG file. So if you shoot raw photos, which a lot of people do, if you're shooting raw, what you're seeing on the screen when you chimp is a JPEG that is embedded in the raw file. And so the picture on the screen on your camera looks different than the raw file. So depending on what settings you have in your camera for shooting with JPEGs, your color saturation could be way different. Your contrast could be different. Brightness, you could have it making greens really bright, and you know, all kinds of things. So there's all those settings in your camera, which are called natural or standard or you know, vivid, or all kinds of things that look totally, make the JPEG look totally different, and thus the picture on your screen look really different. So if you use Lightroom, you ever notice when you're in the grid mode, if you pull up a bunch of pictures, they'll come up and they'll look bright, and then they'll kind of go pop, 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 and look dull. That's the JPEG preview showing first. Then Lightroom brings in what the raw really looks like after the JPEG. So it's very important that you realize what you're looking at, especially if you want to be shooting raw, is not what you're seeing. You're seeing a JPEG, and we'll talk more about that later.
That's what all cameras do?
All cameras show you the JPEG. So during the day, it is hard to tell if your exposure is right because of the brightness of the sunlight, but your screens are adjusted and designed to be viewed in sunlight, since that's when most people take pictures, right? So the screens are very bright and vivid and trying to show you a lot of color and light. But when you go out and shoot at night, the screen is still set for brightness, for being very, very bright, for being viewed in the brightness. And so if you take a picture at night, it could look perfect on when you're chimping, but then you put it in the computer and suddenly it's way too dark. What happened? Well, when you're chimping, you're seeing that very bright image, which looks nice, but that's not what it really looks like because your screen is way too bright. You know, it's the exact same thing going on at night to the opposite extent of what happens during the day. When your sun's hitting it, you can't see the screen, right? The picture looks too dark, but it's just because you can't see the screen. Well, at night, the same thing's happening. You can't trust the screen because there's not enough light hitting the screen. Your eye is adjusted to darkness and the screen's way too bright. So it makes the picture look perfect. And then you get home and it's like, oh man, that thing's way too dark. What happened?
But doesn't your eye adjust to the light?
Yeah, and that's even worse. So the question is, doesn't your eye adjust to the light? That's even worse because if you're out in the darkness, your eyes become even more sensitive, and then you're looking at your screen and it's even brighter then, which compounds the problem. So there's some things you can do. You can lower the brightness on your screen. The problem is how much? Don't know. So you have to do some testing. You have to do some testing. So one way to be sure you get an absolute accurate image and stupid stupid, not stupid. They're not stupid. They're anal photographers carry a grayscale with them. And they'll photograph that grayscale and then look at that when they're chimping. And if you can see 0% and 100% when you're chimping, you know your screen brightness is right because you can see both extremes. And then that will help you recognize your exposure. If you actually take a picture of it, it'll also help you later in post-processing, which a lot of folks do too, but that's a total different story. But that will tell you, you know, if your exposure is right, and that's true daytime or nighttime. So, you know, very critical photographers, if like studio photographers who are photographing products or fabric or something like that, where both the color and the brightness have to be exactly right. Shoot a grayscale and a color grid so they can make sure they absolutely get the perfect light. But that's, you know, that's really crazy. I'm too lazy to carry a grayscale with me, so I've learned to see the screen and know when I'm seeing the screen, is that what I'm really getting? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you know, if you're pulling out a grayscale, it needs to be in the same light as what you're photographing. So if what you're photographing is on the other side of the river and you're standing in the dark and it's bright over there, doesn't do you any good to photograph the scale over here because it's bright on that side of the river. But if the light's everywhere the same, you pull it out and it'll help you out. But there's another way to shoot in low light, is to chimp a photo that you shot during the day and look at it in the darkness. So if you shot it during the day, you know the exposure was probably pretty right. And then you look at it in the darkness and you say, wow, that looks really too bright. Well, but you know the exposure is right. So it's, again, your screen is too bright. So you can either then adjust your screen to make that picture look right. Then you know everything you shoot the rest of the time in darkness will even out. Or you can pull up a picture you shoot at night and kind of match it against that and say, if you don't dim your screen, oh, okay, this one's that much too bright. My night shot needs to be that much too bright. Okay, so you kind of do a test that helps you figure out which one's which. And so you need to do all this testing when you're not shooting something important. So, you know, you're sitting around at home and you take a picture of under the couch and see how dark it is in there and just, you know, pull it up and put it in the computer and see what's what. And then you'll know, you know, if it looks the same all the time. Like some of the Sony cameras now have automatic brightness control on the screens. And from what I can tell, they seem to be doing pretty well. I don't have a Sony, but they seem to manage the screen brightness pretty well. My Canon, you know, I can adjust the brightness, and there's an auto setting on that, but I don't trust it at all. That's not, you know, how much, you know, who's decided how bright it should be? Some engineer somewhere, you know, not me, so I don't trust them. So, you know, just test it, play with it. Just be aware that what you're seeing a lot of times when you're chimping is not at all accurate. Okay. So there's some other factors that come into play too, but you know, that's the main thing. So lower that screen brightness when you need to, and you'll be fine. So generally when we're shooting, we're worried more about making sure the bright areas of the picture are not too bright versus the dark areas of the picture being too dark. That is because if the whites are blown out or there's no detail in the whites, we've lost all detail, we can't get that back. If the whites are blown out, they're gone. Nothing we can do about that. If the blacks and the shadows are too black, there may be some detail in there we can pull out in post-processing. So we might be able to get that. If we can't get that detail back in the shadows, that might not be horrible anyway. I prefer having my shadows pretty blocked up, pretty black. It adds a lot of drama to pictures. It adds depth. So I don't mind when my shadows are too dark. But I don't want my highlights blowing out, hardly ever. It's pretty rare that I'll let the highlights go. So this is a picture I shot yesterday in Central Park. And when I was chimping, the camera told me that my highlights were too bright. Well, when I look at this, they're not. So especially, it was telling me the upper left corner was blown out. So this is the photo after I processed it. And this is what it looked like on the screen. So the way it told me that my highlights were too bright was I have my Blinkies turned on. So Blinkies are an alert that says your whites are too white. And in Canon, it's called the highlight alert. I don't know what Nikon and everybody else calls it, but it's something along like about the highlights. The highlights are too bright. And so on my Canon, it will give me, and all of them, the Blinkies will give you a flashing black. So you can see here in the upper left corner of this picture where it's black, that's the Blinkies on. If I had video going, you'd see that was flashing on and off, but it's a still photo. So several things are happening here. It's saying that area is too white, but when I just showed you the photo that I processed, it wasn't. So what the hell happened? Well, remember, number one, we're viewing the JPEG. So the Blinkies are working off the JPEG, not the raw file, right? So the Blinkies are helpful, but they lie to you. You know, actually, many things in your camera, you know, your camera is just a dirty two-faced liar. You know, that's what it really comes down to. I said it, and I know it's, you know, it's liar, liar, pants on fire. You know, I don't believe anything my camera tells me. It's a liar. Question?
So how are you metering this particular shot? Were you metering for the shadows? Or?
We'll talk about that in a bit.
I
Okay.
had a question.
So,
with the LCD, the light that's shining on it is also affecting the quality of the picture. Is that true?
so the question is, the light shining on the LCD when you're chimping is affecting the quality of the picture. It's not affecting the exposure. It's affecting how you're viewing the chimping. So if you got the Blinkies going, it doesn't matter how much light's hitting the back of the camera when you're chimping. This is all from the shot that you processed. If you shoot live view, the Blinkies will happen before you take the picture, so you can adjust before that. But if, you know, after the fact, the Blinkies will just tell you that that part of the picture is too bright. If you don't want that part of the picture to be too bright, take another picture and darken your exposure is what it really comes down to. But again, remember, we're looking at the JPEG. So again, the JPEG could have the brightness turned up. It could have the contrast turned up, could have saturation turned up. It's actually using a different color space. The JPEG's an sRGB, and depending on what camera you have, The raw file is not sRGB. It's again, that depends on what camera you have, but it's a different color space, meaning it sees more colors than the sRGB, which is the standard for the web. So one thing is pretty much certain though, if you don't see blinkies, you're not blowing out your highlights. So you don't have to worry if you're not seeing blinkies. But if you are seeing blinkies, are you really blowing out the highlights? Again, who knows, right? Who knows? So this is another shot from yesterday. And so the blinkies told me that I had no detail at all in the Radio City Music Hall sign, that's where it says Radio City. It said that was all pure white. My blinkies were saying, that's all pure white. You're in trouble. You need to darken it down. And I said to my camera, liar, liar, pants on fire. I know better. Because it's that JPEG. And so you need to learn what your camera is doing, and you need to take some test shots again and see at what point do the blinkies start. So I suggest, doesn't matter what you photograph, doesn't have to be anything, just something that's got some white in it, and just start increasing your exposure by 1/3 of a stop until you get to the point where the blinkies start. Then do another couple shots past that and get more blinkies going. And then put those photos in your computer, open them up in Lightroom, and see if that first place where you started getting blinkies, if in Lightroom you're seeing any detail in there. And I'll show you in a second how to do that. And then the next one, the next one, the next one. And you can pretty quickly figure out at what point does my camera say I'm blowing out the highlights, and what point do I really start blowing out the highlights? My camera, it's about 1 1/3 stops. So if at the point where it's telling me right now you're starting to blow out your highlights, I'm going, nope, I got another full stop of exposure that I can increase before I get to that point. So you need to look at all those bracketed exposures in your computer, and at the same time hold your camera right beside it so you can see which ones are blinking and which ones are looking good in the computer. The computer's right, by the way. Lightroom's right. Your camera's naughty, right? So to see that in Lightroom, and I can't show you every program, but in Lightroom, you simply move your cursor over the area that you want to get a reading on. And this is a luminance reading. And in the upper right corner, up by the histogram, there's a set of numbers. And so pure white is R100, G100, blue 100, B100. Anything less than that has details. So you can see in this picture from Radio City Music Hall, my R was 98.8, my G was 98.6, and my blue is 94.3. I've still got detail in there, right? And so you can see when you look at the photo, the whole lettering's not pure white. There's color in there. There's yellow. And since the blue number's low, that means there's yellow. So, but in the get your tickets, that's blown out. That's all white. I'm not going to get anything back out of that. If I was in Lightroom, I can move my cursor over and show you how those numbers will be 100, 100, 100. There's nothing there. I'm not going to get any detail back. So after you're doing your test, you'll notice, well, on mine, maybe the blinkies start at 92% or 95% or 98%. That, you know, it's pretty important to know that so you don't freak out. Oh my God, I'm blowing out my highlights and I need to back it off. Okay. So, you know, yes.
So if you were actually shooting in JPEG and it said you had blinkies, then you're done.
If you're actually, yeah, the question is, if you're actually shooting in JPEG and it says you have blinkies, you have blinkies. Okay. And you're not going to get anything back. So that means your highlights are blown out in your JPEG file. And if you're shooting JPEG, and you're fairly serious about your photography, you want to, as soon as you can, get the raw files. Now, most cameras will shoot both. So if you're a little uncomfortable with having to process, you know, the advantage of JPEG files are you don't have to do any processing. The camera will do most of the processing for you, and they create a smaller file. And you can put that file, you can send that to somebody and they can open it and see it right away. A raw file captures, well, so JPEG is also compressed. And so when it's compressed, it loses data. It throws away data. That's how they make the file smaller. And so the raw file is uncompressed. So it has the full data the camera can capture, but it hasn't had any processing done to it. So every raw file needs to have some processing done. Could be very little, could be a lot. Could be just pumping up the blacks. Could be, just increasing the contrast a little. Could be, whatever. But a JPEG file is fine for a lot of things, but you have a lot more control over the raw file in post-processing. So I highly recommend getting to raw files as soon as you can. And like I say, if you're uncomfortable with that, start off shooting JPEG and RAW. The next time you take out your camera, have it shoot both. And if you don't know what to do with the RAW, save them for later, because at some point you will, and you'll wish you had them, because you can do a lot more in post-processing with the RAW than the JPEGs. Okay.
So in a JPEG file, the camera's deciding what data they get rid of or toss.
Yes, so it's deciding, so on the JPEG file, the camera's deciding what data to toss when it's doing the compression, but it's also deciding what data to add when it makes the picture. Do you want it to have more contrast? Do you want it to have more saturation? And that's all in the file settings of the camera.
And some engineer decided that.
And some engineer decided that based on
It's probably not a
whatever he was smoking that day, right?
Probably not a photographer.
Yes.
Does it work in reverse for the black? So that you know that you've got pure black rather than raising it, you're not sure whether you're in the grays now.
So the question is, does it work the same in the blacks? No, there's nothing in a camera to tell you when your blacks are not black enough, because that is really easy to do in post-processing. So in Lightroom, you just slide your black slider and the blacks will get black really quick. So no, you're usually worried only about the bright end. You let the dark end take care of itself to a point.
Processing, that's not post-processing. How do you know how much to bring those blacks up before you're now really looking at the rays?
We are going to talk about that in a moment. So next question, we'll talk about that in a moment. So there is another tool in your camera to help you with your exposure, and that's called the histogram. And it's the most misunderstood thing there is. And what a histogram does is it shows you the distribution of luminance values in the image. What the hell does that mean? The luminance value. So what the histogram is showing you is there are 256 steps of luminance or brightness of whatever your scene is. And it is totally dependent on the scene. So every scene, everything that you photograph is going to have a different looking histogram. There is no right histogram, right? Everyone is different. And so, and it shows you, what the histogram is showing you is how much dark area is in the scene or how much bright area is in the scene. So the left side of the histogram is the dark, the right side is the light. So in the picture that I'm showing, you can see the histogram there, and it's shot at night. So the histogram is going to be heavy to the left side because there's a lot of darkness in the picture, right? It's a shot at night. There's going to be a lot of dark. But on the right, there's a whole bunch of, the right wall, I always call it, shoots straight up. So if you're hitting the wall, you're losing detail. So that very strong line going up the right side means I'm blowing out a lot of highlights.
Oh.
Now, I just said that's bad, but it depends on the photo. So where I'm blowing out the highlights in this one is the reflection to the left of the red ball, or there's a white blob right to just beside the left red ball. In the lower left corner, there's a very bright spot. The windows in the building are blown out because the light in there is so bright. So the Christmas lights on the trees, the actual light bulb is blown out. You're never going to get detail on a light bulb, right? So there's a whole lot in that picture that is blown out. I don't care. There's no way I'm ever going to get, Christmas lights on a tree, get detail in those light bulbs. I don't want it because everything else would be pitch black. So, so in this case, yeah, my histogram's telling me I'm blowing out a whole lot of stuff, but I don't care. I don't care about that. So if anyone tells you they can look at a histogram and tell you if your exposure's right, pardon my French, they're full of shit. Okay. You can't look at a histogram and say, yeah, that was a good exposure, or no, that's a bad exposure, because it is totally dependent on what the values, light values are in the scene that's being photographed, right? So
your goal in that picture was to photograph the ornaments.
so my goal is right. I want the ornaments right in that photo. I don't care about the, the highlights are going to have to blow out because it's nighttime, and then the shadows are going to be dark because it's nighttime, right?
Mhm.
So in a picture like this, that is pretty low contrast, you can see the histogram up in the upper right corner, and it's pretty much just a mountain in the middle, right? So a low contrast picture is going to have a mound that looks like that, and there's nothing touching the left side, meaning there's nothing black. There's nothing touching the right side, meaning there's nothing white in the picture. Okay. But when you get a high contrast scene, your histogram looks totally different. It's going to be high on the left and high on the right, and in the middle could be low, could have some bumps in it, could have a mountain range. Who knows what it's going to look like? So again, in this picture, it's a pretty rugged histogram. And it's telling me, oops, your shadows are too black and your whites are too white. Anybody hate the photo? No, right? It's going to have to look like that. So, all three of these last three photos are exposed properly, but the histograms are vastly different, right? Based on the scene, light values in the scene that we're photographing. Okay.
Now, how do you know all these three photos are exposed properly?
How do they look?
They look good.
Okay, that's the answer.
Okay.
How do you know? The question is, how do you know if they look good? They look good. If they're proper. How do you know if they're properly exposed? Well, they look good.
Yeah.
There are crazy technical ways that you can go in and try to figure out exactly. But do I know exactly what tone the face on this steer was? No. Do I care? No. Now, again, if I was shooting product and, I'm shooting fabric for a designer, I better know exactly what tone that is and nail it.
Yeah.
I'm shooting steers out in the middle of a field in Vermont, is the color that, is the value of the field of whatever that was exactly what it needs to be? I don't know. I've met photographers, studio guys who told me they could tell when a picture was 1/16 of a stop under or overexposed. You know what I said to them? Bullshit. And if you can, good for you. I can't. I don't need to. I can tell you when it's a half a stop or a full stop, but we get so wrapped up in the technical stuff of photography, so wrapped up in the technical that we lose sight of how's it look. I hear people, yeah, I've got this lens and it'll do this and this and this. And what do you think? And I always say, how's it look? And they say, well, it's a little soft in the corners. Well, then it's a little soft in the corners. Can you live with that? Yeah, then it's great. It's perfectly sharp all the way across. Is that what you want? Yeah, then it's great. So it's always, do you want to spend more money and make it better? You can probably, but you don't need to. Because, when you're looking at histograms, they're a guide. And again, we're looking at the JPEG. I don't know what my raw file really looked like on this.
Now, if you brought let's say you had this photo and you brought it up in Lightroom,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a raw. Will the histogram be the same?
The histogram will be the raw. What you're seeing is the raw.
Okay, but it wouldn't look like this. It might be maybe more
Right.
high. Okay.
Actually, this one's being pulled out of Photoshop, so this is what the raw histogram looked like on this one. But
And the JPEG
yeah,
might have been a little
yeah.
bit
If
different.
you shoot JPEGs and RAWs, and you have them both come up in Lightroom, and you click between them, you'll see your histogram change.
Okay.
Most of the time. Sometimes it won't, but most of the time your histogram is going to change. And which one's right? Yeah, who knows? Does it really matter? So, again, This is the histogram off the JPEG on the back of the camera. So I use my fancy phone, iPhone, to take a picture of the back of my, you know, I chimped and photographed the chimp, right? And so, so take a look, you know, look at this histogram. Pretty rugged on the left, really high on the left. This is what the camera told me. This is what Lightroom showed me on the histogram. Same photo, raw, no processing done to it. So the gray is what you want to look at. So you can see the gray is a lot smoother than it was on the, so this is the raw file. So the histogram, the luminance part is looking a lot different in this shot than it did in the JPEG, right? Now you'll notice, you're also seeing some colors showing up in Lightroom. And it's showing you the color values and the brightness of the colors. Now your camera can do that too, but for me, that is worthless information, okay?
And plus it's showing you in JPEG, not RAW.
So, right, one, it's a JPEG, so it depends on how your JPEG is being processed in the camera. But two, if the red is too bright, but the overall scene looks good, what am I going to do to fix that? I don't know. I do know, you put a green filter on the camera. Well, then your whole picture turns green, right? But your red came down, now your blue and your yellow's off. So, you know, most cameras, you can turn off the color histogram and just look at the luminance histogram, which is, in this case, the top one is the luminance histogram. The bottom one is the color one. I swear they throw this one in there. This is purely a marketing thing. Look what our camera can do. We can show you the color. You know, now when you're in Lightroom or Photoshop, the color can be important because you can control it. You can change just the red or just the blue. You can't do that in camera. So in the camera, it's worthless information to me. If somebody knows a good reason why I should be able to know what the reds and yellows or blues are doing versus the luminance, please educate me, because that one I don't know. But
So
turn that off.
My understanding of luminance is it's only black and white.
Well, luminance is essentially black and white. So your sensor is really only black and white, and the meter in your camera is thinking in black and white. There are then filters that are added in the software of the camera that add the color to the picture. That's why you can stand beside somebody else with a different branded camera and pictures look vastly different, because the engineers have engineered it different. And it's also why, you know, I'll be out at things and photographers will be shooting and they'll be looking at the other guys, you know, the person beside their photo, his looks a lot brighter than mine. Or like, look how much more color he's getting. Yeah, you're looking at a JPEG. He's probably got the saturation cranked up on the JPEG. Oh, my pictures look better to you. Then they throw them into, you know, pull the RAW into their computer and they go, oh, where'd everything go? Well, if you know, there is a way in Lightroom to tell your RAW file to look like your JPEG did, but that's not what we're here to talk about. Yes.
Can you go back to the steer?
Can I go back to the steer? Maybe. Oop, too far.
There, no.
So a good portion of that scene is, when you look at the black and white aspect of the histogram, a good portion of that scene is kind of a mid-tone gray. If you look at the grass and the trees, so
Right.
you're going to get a pretty good image out of that if you're metering across the center of that shot, right?
Yes. So the question is, a scene like this, you're getting a pretty even, you know, distribution of tones. So you can expect that your histogram is going to be pretty strong in the middle. And in this case, it is. You know, you get that big hump right in the middle. What's that really tell us? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But did that answer your question?
Oh, you did.
Okay. Let me get back up to where I was. Okay. So what is the histogram really good for? Well, there's this theory called exposure to the right technique. ETTR, exposure to the right. I like ETTR. Basically, it says you should push your exposure as far right as you can without blowing out your important highlights. Now, you might blow out unimportant highlights, but you don't want to blow out your important highlights. So this is a shot I did yesterday in Central Park, and I'm shooting at 1/1000th of a second at f6.3. And looking at the histogram, I can see that the right, I still have room to move things to the right. So your histogram on your camera has those vertical lines. They represent a full stop increment. So if I want to move that middle hump to the right, a full stop,
Done.
I need to go from 1/1000th of a second to 1/500th of a second. And so pay attention to the histogram on this shot. And now when I go to the shot with 1/500th of a second, you can see that hump in the middle moved from between the second and third line to between the, oh, I'm sorry, moved from between, if you're counting from left to right, 1, 2, third column to the second column, right? And now we're getting right to the edge of our right wall. So we're getting right up close to the edge of that right wall, meaning we're just about ready to blow out our highlights. But again, we're working off the JPEG. So we're a little,
So you went down a stop in that case.
so I brightened it a stop.
Okay.
So I made it a stop brighter.
So you went up a stop, right?
So, right. So I slowed my shutter speed down. Right. So, you know, also notice maybe that the shadows have gotten brighter. So we have more detail in the shadows here. Now, when I drop down another stop to 1/250th of a second, I'm really up against the wall on the right. My blinkies are yelling at me. You can see in the upper right corner, the black there, upper right corner of the image. And now my histogram has come, the hump has gone all the way to the first column, and the hump up against the left side has moved off the wall, meaning I have lots of detail in my shadows now.
Right side.
So now it's decision time. Do I want to, am I more concerned about the shadows in this scene or my highlights? Because this is one of those shots where in one shot, you can't get it all because of the dynamic range of the scene. So you have darks, darks, and brights. Sky is pretty bright, backlit scene. Am I going to get detail in those shadows? So for me, the middle exposure back one stop is the best one, because I can then in post-processing open up those shadows a little bit more, and I can bring those highlights down that I haven't lost the highlights. In this case, you know, that sky is going to be white forever. There's no way I'm going to put anything back into that sky unless I bring a sky in from Montana, which I don't do.
Will you back up to 1/1000th, please?
So the question is, will I back up to 1/1000th? So there's 1/1000th of a second.
So there is stuff in the sky.
So there is detail in the sky. There's always detail in the sky. Depends how dark you shoot.
Yeah.
I mean, in theory, you know, if you know. So in this case, yeah, there is detail in the sky. And I was thinking this is 1/500th of a second, but it's only 1/640, so it's actually 2/3 of a stop.
And still some detail.
And there's still detail in the sky, which is, in this case, very important to me. So I can bring that detail, essentially the detail that we're seeing back here on the 1/1000th of a second, I can bring that back in Lightroom or Photoshop. For me, Lightroom's a lot faster and easier. That I see here. Now, when I get down to the 1/250th of a second shot, that detail is totally gone. There's no way I'm getting that back. But as you can see, you see a lot more detail around the little pond there and under the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So using the histogram can be good. It can be devastating. You know, if you're depending on the histogram for your exposure, you know, remember that you're getting fooled by a lot of things, mainly that JPEG RAW problem. but also, you know, it doesn't really tell you a whole lot other than the extremes. You know, you can't say, well, I should have a big hump in the middle unless you're shooting fog. You know, if you shoot a fog scene, then you better have just a nice bell curve and it'll be right in the middle. But anything else, it is totally dependent on how many blacks are in the scene, how many whites are in the scene, what, you know, light tones, what middle tones, what gray, you know, dark grays, dark, you know, and that's what determines the histogram. So that's what I really tell people to watch out for.
Are you a big proponent of bracketing?
Am I a big proponent of bracketing? I call it the BLH, bracket like hell factor. Bracketing is changing your exposure. So I bracket like crazy.
Okay.
So you know, a scene like this one, I'll shoot what the meter tells me, which I know is rarely right. And then I will underexpose it, a stop, maybe underexpose it, and another stop, and maybe overexpose it, a stop, which pretty much guarantees me I'm going to hit my exposure. Now, you know, nothing's moving in this scene. If I'm shooting, you know, a hockey game, you better just figure out what the exposure is and shoot the same, because you're going to miss the moment, which is why I now shoot landscapes, so I don't have to worry about missing the moment, right? I shot enough moving things in my life that I had to nail the exposure right away. Now it's just BLH it and bracket like hell. Just, you know, and when I'm bracketing, I always bracket my shutter speed versus my aperture, and there's a couple reasons for that. If you bracket a lot, you can then later in software use the multiple images as an HDR and put them together. And if you changed your aperture versus your shutter speed, your depth of field will change, and then you can't blend those photos together very easily, if at all. It's possible, but it's a real pain. So always bracket using your shutter speed, unless it's a moving object, you know, then you have to nail your shutter speed, and you might bracket with your.
So you shoot shutter priority?
So-
Shoots in.
So I always shoot manual.
Always.
I don't trust my camera. But I would recommend people shoot aperture priority. And to bracket, you have to do exposure compensation. And if you don't know how to do exposure compensation, that should be the next thing you learn if you're shooting aperture priority or any of the automatic modes. The very next thing you should learn is exposure compensation, how you can do that very fast. So when you see that, oh, this looks a little too bright, I'm blowing up, my blinkies are telling me I'm blowing up my highlights. How do I lower that exposure by a stop? And know the difference between a third of a stop and a full stop. Because a third of the stop's probably not going to, you know, if you're right at the edge, it'll do something. But if you're going to bracket, go a full stop. Some people who shoot HDR heavily, hi Rick, shoot two-stop HDRs, so they'll do the proper exposure or what the meter says. 2 stops underexposed, maybe another 2 stops underexposed, 2 stops over, and another 2 stops over to blend those 3 to 5 images to make an HDR.
Hi, Lauren.
Hi, Rick. So one thing I just wanted to mention real quick is I've got some workshops coming up next year, doing a Manhattan and Brooklyn night workshop on January 18, Iceland in February 16 to 20. And I screwed up and I didn't promote that early enough for people. And so there's going to be a Black Friday sale on that starting tomorrow, $250 off on that. So I also have a night workshops coming up in June in Vermont and July, which are light painting and the sky. So we'll do some astrophotography, hopefully. Iceland coming up again in August, and Chile, December 9 to 15, which is the thing I'm looking forward the most. It's the southern lake region of Chile, which is a gorgeous area. I went down there a year ago to scout it, and it's just amazing, and it will culminate with the total solar eclipse. And if you haven't ever experienced a total solar eclipse, it's one thing you have to do in your life, because it makes me cry. So any questions on anything at this point? Yes?
Is the main workshop sold?
Oh, I forgot about the Maine. I didn't put Maine on there. Yeah, I'm doing Acadia. Thank you very much. First week of June, I believe it is, Acadia. Maine.
I see it at end of May, first week.
Yeah. Yeah. Spring in Acadia, which is tons of fun and gorgeous.
Lauren,
Yes.
I'm really a beginner at all this. If I went on one of your trips, would you, would you help me?
I will hold your hand and walk you through all of this. You betcha. That's what it's all about. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay,
Yep.
great. Thanks.
You bet.
No Vermont fall foliage?
Fall foliage is coming up in Vermont too. Yes. Hey, see, I don't have them all on. So I've got a lot of other things happening too that aren't on there. There'll be a lot more New York trips. There'll be Philly trips. There'll be a DC trip, New York City, a couple of weekends. We're going to do 3-day weekend in the city. So things all over the place, and lots of little one dayers too, which I don't have on there. But okay. Any other questions? Anyone?
It's Lauren, that's Gil. So if you're shooting RAW on your camera, what JPEG setting would you recommend? I mean, neutral or?
Yes. Yes. So set your camera on neutral or standard, whatever, depends on the flavor of your camera. Yes. That way you're going to get the most, the closest accuracy of when you're chimping of what it should look like. And turn down, make sure you don't have the contrast turned up. Make sure you don't have anything else turned up. In fact, I hadn't really thought about that much, so I went through my camera to make sure it was, and I was. So I felt good about that. Other questions?